I was just talking to the pastor yesterday, as I mentioned, but one of the things that I think has happened is that, you know, one of the, I guess, negative consequences of thinking that we have everything right is that you have people that they don't study their Bible anymore because they think they have all the right information. And so, you know, what are you studying? Well, I'm not studying. I'm not studying anything. Why? You know, we already have the truth. We're just waiting for Jesus to come, you know. And then, but of course, that whole state of mind is a deception in itself. And then, so what happens is that people that are not only not studying the word, but the word that they think they know, they can't even prove. I mean, so you have some simple thing like showing from the Bible that Jesus is God, and then you have people they can't show it from the Bible, or if there is the Holy Spirit, they can't show the simple basic truths of what we call doctrinal truths. They can't even prove them from Scripture anymore because they're not studying their Bible. They're not even reading their Bible. And
People have been conditioned to think that what's holding up Jesus coming back is not that we don't know enough. It's that everybody else needs to come to understand things the way we do.
yeah.
And it's when they think the way we think, then Jesus will come. Rather than there's a growth process, that's for us that we're neglecting.
Yeah.
And, inspiration tells us, Sister White says that, God will send messages and messengers, and if the messages are resisted, which they've been, she specifically said, well, then God will send heresies into the church to sift the church. It's
Right.
the exact thing she said that would happen, and it's the exact thing that has happened.
Right.
The other thing about trying to prove doctrines is it depends on what kind of a Bible you have. I watched Walter Weiss on the Battle of the Bibles, and a lot of the new translations you can't even prove doctrine from. They've been so monkeyed with.
Yeah, but if you're reading your Bible, you would know, right? And you get these new translations and you read them, you would realize something's not right with this.
Well,
right?
if you were brought up or you learned on a, like King James or something like that, you would. But if you were new and coming in and you were learning stuff off from one of these new stuff, and then somebody asked you to prove your doctrine, you couldn't.
Yeah, well, that's true. But I mean, we're really talking about people that think they have the truth already, which is why they're not studying.
Yeah.
Well, I was told by an elder when I talked to them about, studying the word and, about how God will give us the understanding that the early church didn't have. And he says, well, we don't need to know any of that because when we'll be told everything when we get to heaven. And I said, well, wouldn't he want you to prepare you for things? He's preparing us. And yeah, that was what?
Yeah, that's scary, huh?
Yeah, that's what you're talking about, though.
And yeah, it is. Well, the gentleman I talked to yesterday, it clicked to him. It clicked. So he said something, and I said, well, so this, it's the 10 sleeping virgins. They're the reason why Jesus isn't coming back, right? It's like, and he looked at me. It's like, well, no, they're asleep. Well, yeah. So whose responsibility is it that Jesus isn't coming back? I mean, there's a person supposed to be waking up the other virgins at midnight because he knows the time and he has the proper food at the proper time. And so if Satan convinces Adventists that we're one of the sleeping virgins when we're supposed to be the one waking up the sleeping virgins, well, then how long does this sleeping process keep going? Well, obviously, it's until God wakes up the messenger that's supposed to be waking up the other sleeping virgins. That's the answer to the question. And
hey, Pastor.
Yes.
Speaking of sleeping and standing up, can you just maybe address a couple of minutes? I know you've covered this a lot in the past, but you had taken the vision of Daniel in chapter 10, where this is Daniel has fallen on his face several times and stood up you were comparing that to Revelation, the 7 standing ups in verses chapters 12 through 15. And are the Revelation, most of those standings up, is that the beast? Is that the dark side? I mean, there's sevens, the 7 angels, there's the 144,000. I was just kind of just to get into your brain a little bit how this chiasm is spanning across chapters.
Okay. Well, when you're
I
dealing
just
with,
picked that one. Maybe you want to pick a different one instead.
well, that's fine. That doesn't matter. So you're dealing with the 7 standings in Revelation. You're at the porch, right? Because that's where if you go to 2 Kings 11, that's where the king stands by the pillar to be coronated. So of course the porch or the gate imagery becomes critical. That's where Daniel, remember, when Daniel explains the vision, the dream to Nebuchadnezzar, then he takes his seat at the gate of the king. So the gate or the porch there is significant. In the book of Revelation, the 7 standings from Revelation 12 to Revelation 15, the 7 standings are at the porch. Now they're not described as sevens again, because the 3 sevens are already dealt with. But so what you have is the standing of the woman, the standing of Michael, the standing of the dragon. So you have the standing of both kingdoms, because that's where the dragon and the beast and the false prophet stand. It's the same place where the woman stands and Michael stands, or the lamb stands, Revelation 14. And then of course the 144,000 are going to stand, and it ends with them standing on the sea of glass. So you have the 2 kingdoms standing opposite each other. By the way, that's what Armageddon means. The 2 kingdoms meet at an appointed time or appointed place, and there's this final confrontation between the 2 kingdoms. That's what happens in Revelation 12 through 15. That's why you see the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet, Revelation 12, and then 13, the 3 parts of his kingdom. And you also see Christ and the woman, you see Michael, and then of course you see the 144,000. So you see the 3 parts of God's kingdom standing, and then you see the 3 parts of Satan's kingdom standing, and that's why it's the 7 standings at the porch in the middle of the book of Revelation. Does that answer your question?
I think so. Thank you.
Now once you go past the porch scenes, now you're in the outer court. By the way, you're at the porch. That's why you're seeing dragons and that stuff doesn't happen in the inner court. It only happens in the outer court. There's no dragons in the most holy place or the holy place. There's the dragons and the beasts and all that other stuff that you see is in the outer court, connected to the laver in the outer court, which is the realm of Satan, which he claims is his realm anyway. And so when you get to Revelation 12, you're actually standing at the porch. You're standing at the gate, and that's why you see the 7-headed dragon. And you'll see the beast coming out of the sea, which is the laver, and you start seeing all the outer court imagery. And then Revelation 17, of course, happens at the altar, the laver and the altar burnt offerings, and that's why again you see the dragons and the 7-headed dragon and all this. So yeah, understanding where you are in the sanctuary setting for the different scenes of Revelation is also very important to help you understand the language that's being used to describe that. So that would be my answer to the 7 standings up. The standing up that you see in Daniel 10 or Daniel 12 or Daniel 8. That's the same thing you see happening in the book of Revelation. And you can go through the book of Revelation and see the standing ups. In Revelation 5, the Lamb stands on the throne. Revelation 8, he comes out of the most holy place and he stands at the altar. Revelation 10, he comes down from heaven, and you see this angel with a white cloud. He's actually standing at the gate. Then you see Revelation 11, he's standing with a measuring rod. And then Revelation 12, Michael is standing again. fighting the dragon. Revelation 14, the Lamb stands on Mount Zion. Revelation 15, they're standing on the Sea of Glass. Revelation 19, the angel standing, he's standing in the sun, and he talks to the birds to come to the feast. So there's this idea of the Lamb standing throughout the book of Revelation that actually gives you the process of the book of Revelation. So it's intimately tied to the idea of Michael standing up. Of course, we think, again, as evidence, we think of Michael standing up as one-time event, something that just happens once. But the book of Revelation tells us no, the standing up of Michael is a process of standing ups that take place. And so again, we begin to expand our thinking, and it's not just one time, it's not one event. And it's being able to see, again, to see the event repeated in a pattern and repeated many times in a different context, then gives us an understanding of the book of Revelation, because God is revealing himself to different groups of people at different times throughout the book. I don't know if that helps answer the question that you had, but.
Well, it does, because, always at the very end of Revelation, it doesn't really talk about the second coming as a grand event. There's not a whole chapter devoted to the second coming, because it's in so many different places.
Right, that's right. So it's a process of his coming. Yes, that's right.
And and here the center of this chiastic is the standing up part. I mean, the end result is nice, but you're never going to get the end result if you don't stand up and claim and take what is yours.
Yes, and because
Is
that's right, because the standing up is a conflict over the king, who's the king,
Right.
who's the rightful
Right.
king, which is the essence of the great controversy from the beginning.
right.
So the standing up of Michael, the standing up in the book of Revelation of Christ and his rightful place as king, is the restoration of all things. And so when he's restored to his rightful place, then everything else is the invitation of restoration goes to everything else, all creation. And then that part of creation that rejects that truth, well, of course, that's part of the beast in his image. Yeah. And that's what brings the conflict.
And that makes so much sense, because that brings us back to Daniel 10, because we've got to have that same experience. And,
Right.
We just look at it again, but, it's like it says there's no strength that remained in me. The NASB says, so I was left alone and saw the great vision, yet no strength was left in me. For my natural color turned to a deadly pallor, and I retained no strength. And then he goes on further down. He says, I slept on my face, with my face towards the ground. Well, I mean, that's like a deep sleep on my face. And then
That's right.
and verse 15 again, I set my face toward the ground and was dumb. I mean, it's like that death experience.
Right.
Over.
Yeah.
But yeah, Christ is raising him up on his knees, and he's telling him to stand upright. And I finally stood, but I'm trembling, but I'm there, I'm back on my feet, So, what good is the return of the victory if we haven't stood on our feet, so to say, yet?
That's right. That's right. And he uses death imagery, right? Falling on your face in a deep sleep,
Yeah.
with your face to the ground. See, that's why if you go to, again, Daniel 12, verse 3, or Daniel 12:2, actually, he uses that same type of death imagery, death and awaking imagery, connected with the dust of the earth, and how we can't connect those two, actually those three, because the same thing happens in Daniel chapter 8. That's why I'm looking at all three of those visions, and it gives you insight into each one of them. When you compare them with each other, you begin to see the pattern. And then you say, well, yeah, okay, you want to talk about special resurrection. That's fine for Daniel 12 verse 2, but it means much more than that. It's the experience that the many are going to have at the revelation when Michael stands up, and that's going to actually be the judgment of the living. They're going to make a choice. And some are going to choose wisely and have everlasting life, and some are not going to choose wisely, and they're going to have everlasting contempt. So again, seeing the pattern means that I have no problem with the special resurrection of happening when Jesus comes, but that verse means so much more than that. It's actually dealing with an experience that every living person is going to have to be able to make a decision to which kingdom they belong to before Jesus comes. So this standing up is, you can read the writings of Paul. Paul will talk about standing firm or standing in your faith, standing strong. This idea of standing in the Old Testament is carried into the New Testament many times in many different ways. The idea to stand or to understand means that you've reached a place of maturity, a place of responsibility, that you can actually function in a situation of pressure and stress and still be able to function, that you don't just cave. So that's why Paul will say, after you've done everything to stand, then stand. That's Ephesians, right? So God is so cool. And God is making these things known because it's time. It's time for us to fall on our face. It's time for us to be touched by God and brought trembling to our knees and spend time trembling on our knees before God and being touched by God so that we can stand upright and stand in a position of responsibility and in love shine light to others and invite them to the same process. And and some people will think you're nuts. You mean you're inviting me to this process of where I fall on my face and I see my helplessness and I see my hopelessness and I see my weakness and I, and I'm going, woe is me. Yeah. And that's supposed to be joyful. Yes, it is, because then that's how I become free. That's how I become born again. That's how the beast in me is conquered, and I'm no longer a slave to sin anymore. So there's joy there.
I have a question. Also going into that same chapter, the last two, 26 and 27, when he said, shut up the vision, in other words, keep it to yourself for many days. And at that verse following that he was sick for several days. Was that the being and reviewing everything he was shown, the process?
Yes.
So,
yes,
and he was already foretelling him it'll be for many days that you will be processing this.
Right. And that's why there's years between these visions.
Okay.
So the same thing happens at the end of Daniel 7. Daniel says at the end of Daniel 7, he says, at the end of the matter, as for me, Daniel, my cogitations much troubled me, and my countenance changed in me, but I kept the matter in my heart. So Daniel's wrestling with these things.
Yes.
And by the way, Daniel, the first place Daniel doesn't go, he's not thinking of the papacy or that idiot down the road. Daniel's applying this to himself.
Yeah.
And so Daniel's seeing the beasts and these visions that Daniel's seeing. Daniel sees himself. And his heart is troubled. He's sick to his stomach. He's wrestling with these things.
Right.
And that's how he begins to understand it. So yes.